For very nearly 50 years, the BMW 3 Series has been one of the world's favourite compact executive cars. But rewind some 60 years and that market didn't really exist. It was only really defined in Great Britain by the likes of the Triumph 2000 and Rover P6 in 1963, and BMW didn't really register at all. BMW weren't only not the powerhouse they are today, but had failed to really define themselves at all in the decades leading up to this point. And indeed, at the end of the 1950s, BMW was very near oblivion. But this month at Manor Park Classics, I am privileged to bring you all the BMW 02 series, the predecessor to the 3 Series we know today. And this isn't just some lowly 1602 or 1802. This is a fuel-injected 2002 TII, one of BMW's first ever modern super saloons as part of the range of cars that defined what we perceive as BMW today. So before talking about this car in particular, I want to put your head in that space. At the end of the 1950s into the 1960s, as BMW didn't really know what they were. There wasn't a character that could easily be defined as a BMW, and with a range of cars that didn't really make sense and weren't all that popular, they were very near oblivion, as I just mentioned. In fact, the Quant family considered selling off BMW altogether to Mercedes-Benz of all people. Sense quickly prevailed, however, and they launched a new small economy car known as the 700 in 1959. It was a very small, rear-engined, rear-wheel drive economy car that just did not speak to us in the way BMWs do today. Certainly, it had no kidney grills on the front of it, and dynamically, it didn't meet any of the standards we know again as BMW today. What it did do, however, is save the company. They sold well over 100,000 units over the next few years, and it enabled BMW to define a new philosophy, define a new character, and that's what they brought along in 1962 with the launch of the Neue Klasse. The Neue Klasse was a run-of-the-mill 3-box 4-door family saloon. It had a front-mounted 4-cylinder engine and rear-wheel drive, and while that would be a little bit unusual today in many ways, in 1962 it was run-of-the-mill. It was totally average. And so in order to set themselves apart from the competition, BMW took simple yet competent components and tuned them in a manner that endeared drivers to them. Unlike the Ford Cortinas, for example, that we saw in Great Britain, these BMWs had independent rear suspension by semi-trailing arms, a similar general kind of suspension system as you'd find under the Triumph 2000. Again, at the start of this compact executive market. And at the front, they had McPherson struts. Simple, yes, but provided great delicacy in their handling. 10 years later, BMW would define this new philosophy by tagging their cars as ultimate driving machines. For now, however, they had just one mainstream saloon car that wasn't all that fast. It may have had the independent rear suspension, etc. It may have had a monocoque body shell and a very nicely finished, high-quality interior, as well, of course, as this style dictated by the legendary Wilhelm Hofmeister. But there was no pedigree in it yet. There was nothing to take them on to that next level. The Neue Klasse would be replaced by the first 5 Series in 1972. But before that, in 1966, they would take the Neue Klasse platform, cut it down by a few inches, creating a new, smaller 2-door saloon that they called the 02 Series. That is the car we have before us today, the one that in 1975 was eventually replaced by the 3 Series. So in these two cars, the Neue Klasse and the 02 Series, we have the 5 Series and 3 Series of the 1960s, the first generation of these kind of BMWs. At launch, these cars were usually found, should I say, with a 1600cc version of the all-new overhead camshaft M10 engine that debuted in '62 with the Neue Klasse. Due to their 2-door body style, they were known as the BMW 1600-2. Later that was revised to the BMW 1602, hence why we know these cars as the 02 series of BMWs. And a normal run-of-the-mill 1600cc one of these produced about 85 brake horsepower. Not an awful lot, never mind by today's standards, but it was competent. It was more than enough for the standards of the day. Then they bored that M10 engine out to 2 litres, bringing us the 2002. We also got then the 2002 Ti, touring international, producing 120 brake horsepower. But this was the kind of final rendition of the original 02 series touring international, the TII with fuel injection, meaning 130 brake horsepower. For an idea of what 130 brake horsepower meant in 1971 or so, when this car was first introduced, that was only about 5 brake horsepower or so away from a big 3.5 litre V8 powered Rover. This was a serious amount of power, and 130 brake horsepower eclipsed even the Triumph Dolomite Sprint, which of course came along in 1972-73. Through cars like this, BMW had built themselves from being a bit of a kind of nothing manufacturer, a manufacturer that was struggling financially and had no philosophy. They were kind of blancmange really. They produced anything and everything that they fancied at the time. Within 10 years or so, from 62 to 72, BMW now had a clear philosophy. People knew what to expect from BMW. In 73, they brought us the 2002 Turbo, complete with around 150 brake horsepower, although not many of those cars were built. Of course, in this era, they also had their flagship, the E3 Saloon and E9 Coupe, which led to the iconic Batmobile 3-litre CSL that just wiped the floor with everyone else in the European Touring Car Championship. This car sits at the centre of BMW building not just their character, but also their pedigree as a result. And this car being on a K registration suggests it's from around that kind of era, 1972 there or thereabouts, which means that it's perfect timing for that ultimate driving machine insignia. So we've got the car warming up nice and gently in front of us, and I wanted to start stationary because I just want to address this interior a little bit, because it's quite austere. It's certainly of a very high quality, and that's obviously what BMW spent their money on. But compared to, British compact executive cars of this era, closest resembling an 02 probably being a Triumph Dolomite, and the Dolomite has so much more character and life to the interior. The trim is just so much better thought out than in this. It is quite austere in its layout, and there's no insignia on anywhere in this car. There's nothing to tell you that it's a BMW, which is a little bit strange maybe, but that's how things were. So setting off, and the immediate thing is that that engine is quite gruff. Certainly the refinement of the chassis, refinement of the body shell should I say, and the suspension is very refined. There's not a lot of road noise going on in here, there's not a lot of wind noise either, but that engine always makes its presence known. And for an engine that in 1962 was brand new, overhead camshaft, etc., that's maybe a little bit surprising. But remember that this is the big capacity version, the high performance version, 2 litres, for which it wasn't really designed for, if I'm honest. And with the addition of fuel injection and the higher tuning anyway, never mind the fuel injection, producing 130 brake horsepower from a 2 litre engine was quite a lot in the early 1970s and at the end of the 1960s. So we're, milling along here at 30 odd miles per hour very, very happily indeed. And we have this very snappy short throw gear change, but it's allied then to this huge steering wheel, because of course this car has no power steering. And when you get it singing, it really does accelerate this thing. It is a quick car. But I mentioned the power steering, and of course that means it's very heavy. But I've driven previously a non-power assisted E21, which is the first generation to be known as a 3 Series and the direct replacement of the O2. So this car's immediate successor, and it feels nowhere near as heavy in spite of the fact that that car had an M20 engine, which was BMW's little straight 6. That wasn't a 323i, by the way, that was only a 320, no I. But that gruffness very quickly turned into this incredibly racy character. And indeed, this engine was very successful as a racing engine. In the production cars, it won the 1966 European Touring Car Championship in a larger Neue Klasse. I think that was a 2000 Ti, that car. But then in the smaller O2 series, it won as a works entry in 1968 and 69. I can't quite remember what spec those cars were. I think they might have been standard 2002s or maybe 2002 Ti's. Definitely not the TII that this one is, the final fuel injected version. But later than this M10 engine was then developed into the Formula 1 engine that BMW supplied all the way through into the turbocharged era in the 1980s. So the little 4-cylinder BMW engine that was enormously turbocharged in Nelson Piquet's World Championship winning Brabham Formula 1 car, producing 1500 brake horsepower in qualifying trim, was by and large an M10 engine, as we see here, as fitted to this O2 series BMW. So that's again some serious pedigree just to add to those touring car championship wins, not only of this car and of its big brother, but also of the 3-litre CSL, of course, in the 1970s. Another thing that this car is bringing me quite a lot of is sophistication in its ride and handling, because the ride quality of this car is perfectly adequate. It's nowhere near as harsh as many sports-focused BMWs later became. It has a sense of compliance to it, but the delicacy of the semi-trailing arm rear suspension and the McPherson struts up front make this a very delicate car to drive. Indeed, it's the same basic suspension system that would not only be used by BMW through to the early 90s, but would be used in cars like the E28 5 Series and the E30 3 Series and their M counterparts to brilliant effect. And so I can snap through the gears in this thing now and just hold on for dear life to the very heavy steering. But I can feel so at one with this car. It's such a privilege to drive something like this. Such an important part of history that in the UK we were barely aware of. I've mentioned the Dolomite Sprint, for example, a number of times, but people who were buying a Dolomite Sprint wouldn't have even considered one of these in reality, partly because they were too expensive, but also because they were incredibly left field. A BMW in the 1970s was just unheard of. It's just not the kind of car that you would buy or you would even see on the roads. And that gear change is fantastic. The pedal weights are fantastic as well. The throttle is a little bit too far away from the brake pedal for me, personally. It makes it not so easy to heel and toe, at least with my low skill levels. But it makes it such an occasion to drive it, because with the gruffness of that engine and the weight to the controls, especially the steering, it's not the easiest car in the world to drive. You know, this isn't a Ford of this era, for example, which was designed to be as easy to drive as possible. This isn't a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 Escort. This isn't a Cortina. This is something very, very different, something that is clearly performance facing, but doesn't sacrifice its habitability for the sake of being a performance car. But what it does is give such significant weight to all the controls that you feel like you're doing something. You feel as though you're a part of an orchestra. And as I said, it's a privilege. So if you would like to get your hands on this Tangerine, then please do follow the link in the description. Head over to our website, have a look at this car, read the description, look at the photos of it, and see whether you could see yourself struggling to park it.